Good morning. I am Antoine van Agtmael for coining the word emerging markets in 1981 when I worked with the International Finance Corporation here in Washington, D.C., which is part of the World Bank. Really, when I started all of this, the world of emerging markets looked entirely different. Imagine the BRICS today. China was still a communist country just after the Cultural Revolution. Russia was behind the Iron Curtain. Brazil had a market, but 4,000% inflation, so it was not a viable market to invest in. And India was a bureaucratic mess. In other words, for all practical purpose, these markets didn't even exist as investable markets. And so there were many other markets that didn't exist. These markets still had to emerge, but they did. Today, the situation is very different. Basically, there are very few countries left in the world that don't have a market. In my book here, The Emerging Market Century, I wrote about the 4 conditions you really need for a viable emerging markets. And I compared it to a stool. A stool has 4 legs and a seat. What are those 4 legs? First of all, growth. Second, low inflation. Third, reasonable macro and political stability. And fourth, competitiveness. And what is the seat? Market regulation. Let me talk about each of these points. First, economic growth. If you don't have growth, companies don't need money to expand. And people in the market don't like to buy shares of companies that are not growing. So growth is absolutely important. Second is low inflation. Think of Brazil with a 1,400% inflation. Market wasn't viable. Inflation really has to be below 10% because then the interest rates can come down and don't compete and companies can be viable. The third is reasonable political and economic stability. If there's war or people are after each other, clearly it doesn't work. If you have huge budget and current account deficits, you cannot have a stable market. My rule of the thumb is if the budget deficit and the current account deficit add up to more than 8% of GDP, you have a problem. And finally, competitiveness. That's something that Korean companies in particular understand very, very well. First of all, the currency has to be competitive, and then the companies have to have something to sell. If you can't export, you are not worth your salt as a company. So those are the 4 basic conditions. But then on top of that, you need market regulation. Because investors have to have a feeling that they're treated fairly. If they're not, whether they're institutional investors, small investors, or foreign investors, they won't come. So those are the things really required to have a viable market. Your conference talks about 3D printing. It talks about big data. It talks about bioscience. The key to this is that information technology, wireless communications, sensors, robotics, 3D printing, big data, medical discoveries, new materials, all of these things will be integrated into smart new products. And those who can do that best and those who can do that fastest will be the winners in this new, smarter world. It is an entire transformation that will really have an enormous impact on all of our daily lives. After studying the global economy for 30 years and investing in emerging markets for 30 years, I have become firmly convinced that the competitive edge is shifting again. The key question is not going to be who can make the smartest product. The key here is not a battle for cheap labor, but a battle for innovation. Let me just add one word of warning for those of you who are investors. Of course, all of these technologies that you will be discussing in the conference, from 3D printing to big data to smart food, etc., are very important. But as an investor, I have learned in 30 years of investing, it is often not the things that are in the press, the things that are popular, the things that the brokers talk about, that are the best investments. No, the best investments are often things that are very boring, that are underrated, that are not in the news. So keep that in mind when you invest. You do it only if you can do it if it's new and exciting, but not too expensive.